Hey everybody, this is Mr. Lowe. We're looking at lesson 7-6, estimating sums and differences of mixed numbers. So we're going to start out with our first problem, and we're actually going to start out pretty simple. I just want to look at a mixed number, and let's do 11 and 4, 6. So I've got a fraction, 4, 6, and a whole number, 11, and when these are together, we call that a mixed number. And what we want to be looking at is to see if we can round that mixed number to the nearest whole number. So, I can't see that color. Let's try changing the color. There we go. So I have a number line, and in my number line, I'm going to label it this time from 11 to 12, because what I'm trying to do is round 11 and 4, 6 to the nearest whole number. And just like what we did when we rounded fractions to the nearest whole number, we want to focus our attention right on this fraction right here, 4/6. Because if 4/6 is bigger than 1/2 or less than 1/2, that's going to tell us what we're going to round 11 and 4, 6 to. So as I look at 4, 6, well, I know half of 6 is 3. And when we did estimating fractions, we said, well, if my numerator is bigger than half of my denominator, half of 6 is 3 and 4 is bigger than 3, that means 4/6 would be bigger than 1/2. So 11 and 4/6 is going to be somewhere located over here, 11 and more than 11 and a half. So 11 and 4/6 is really about equal to 12. Because again, 4/6 is more than a half. And since it's more than half of 11, or more than half of 11 and a half, then 11 and 4/6 is greater than 12. Let's try another one. Let's do 2 and 1/8. So I have 2 and 1/8. My two benchmark whole numbers are going to be 2 and 3. So I'm trying to determine if 2 and 1/8 is going to be about equal to 2 or about equal to 3. And in your head, you can think of where half is between 2 and 3. And I look at my denominator, and I say, hey, my denominator is 8. If I take 8 and cut it in half, that would be 4. So 1/2 would be 4/8, and because my numerator 1 is less than my 4, half of my denominator, that means 2 and 1/8 is actually going to be closer to the whole number 2, because 1/8 is closer to 0 than it is to 1 whole. So this would say 2 and 1/8 is about equal to 2. Again, maybe I should restate that a little bit. We focus right here on the fraction, and we say 1/2 or 1/8 is less than half. So 1/8 is closer to 0, 0, a half, and a whole. And because 1/8 is over here somewhere, it's much closer to 0 than it is to 1 whole. That would mean that 2 and 1/8 is much closer to 2 than it is to 3. Now, why are we going through all this? Because now we're going to take a look at fractions, and in this case, we're going to be estimating sums and differences. So now let's take that 2 and 1/8 minus, and let's subtract 5/7. And I want to figure out what is that about equal to. So for 2 and 1/8, I need to decide, is it going to be a 2 or is it going to be a 3? And we already know that 2 and 1/8 is closer to 2 than it is to 3, so we're going to keep 2 and 1/8 at 2. For 5/7, I can use my number line. And I can ask myself, is 5/7 more than a half? If it is, then it's closer to 1. Is it less than a half? If it isn't, if it is less than a half, then it's closer to 0. We take a look at that denominator. We see that my denominator right here is 7. And finding half of 7 is not the easiest thing, but I can find half of 6, and half of 6 is 3. and I can find half of 4, which is 2. So half of 7 should be, actually, I wouldn't do 4. I would do half of 6, and I would do half of 8. So half of 6 is 3, and half of 8 is 4. So half of 7 has got to be between 3 and 4. And half of 7 is 3.5. Since 5 is more than half of 7, 5 is greater than 3.5, that would mean I would round 5/7 up to 1 whole. Another way to look at it is I can take this number line and break it up into 7 pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I would do 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/7 is right here. That means it is more than 1/2, which means it's closer to 1 whole than it is to 0. So 5/7 becomes a 1, which means 2 1/8 minus 5/7 is about equal to 1 whole. And we're going to do another example. So here we go. Let's take a look at, let me get to my pen. Oh, I'm on my pen. Whoa, hey, go away. Thank you. How about 12 1/3? 12 1/3 plus 2 1/4. We can do it this way. Plus 2 1/4. So I need to take a look at 12 1/3 and decide if 12 1/3 is closer to 12 or closer to 13. And I know 1/3 is less than 1/2, so 12 1/3 is going to stay at 12. When I look at 2 1/4, well now if I focus on the red here, 2 1/4, is it closer to 2 or closer to 3? And I know 1/4 is over here, it's less than 1/2. So 2 1/4 becomes 2, which would mean 12 1/3 plus 2 1/4 is about equal to 14. So as we go through these today, really want to just be focused and be mindful as to what we're doing and where we're going. And let's take a look and see if we can get some real problems just to kind of take a gander at. So the first few here and the first few in your homework buddy are going to be just to estimate, just to round that fraction, 10 6/9, to either 10 or to 11. And again, focus on the fraction. Is 6/9, is it more than 1/2 or less than 1/2? If it's more than 1/2, we're going to round it to 11. If it's less than 1/2, we're going to round it to 10. And then the first couple are going to be like that. Now we actually get into a math problem. When we get into a math problem, first thing we want to do is write it down. So this is number 3. And I am doing 4 1/9 minus 5/8. And I look at 4 1/9 and I need to decide, is that closer to 4 or closer to 5? Well, I look at the fraction 1/9. I know 1/9 is a lot less than 1/2. So that means 4 1/9 is going to be less than 4 1/2, which rounds 4 1/9 to 4. 5/8, well, half of 8 is 4, and 5, my numerator, is more than 4, so 5/8 is more than 1/2, which rounds this up to 1 whole, which should estimate this out to be about 3, and we can check that. I don't want to type. There we go. We can check that by typing the number 3 and checking our answer, and we get a well done. So that's really all you are doing today.